Hello, everyone. To day 4 of SoilPalooza. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Janelle. Day 4, super excited. Woo.
Gonna give us this lovely background while everyone files in today. All right, so I have another poll that I'm gonna pop up too. While people are filing in. Hello, everyone. As you are rolling in, if you wouldn't mind. It looks like our poll has closed. Oh, there we go. Yeah, we're gonna wait another 4 minutes here, get started at about 6:10, give people a chance to settle in for the evening. If you don't mind taking our poll, gives us some info about some continued learning topics you might be interested in. Welcome back to another night of SoilPalooza. We have a whole bunch more fun videos to watch today. Our topics for the evening include compost maturity and quality testing. We're going to see some videos about different ways that people distribute their compost in their communities.
Janelle,
And
this is Leticia. Whenever you're ready, you can switch me over to the Spanish, and I'm happy to share the comments that you've just said previously in Spanish if you'd like.
Perfect. Yeah, we're just kind of filling some time while people roll in this evening, and then we'll get started just with our intro. I don't want to send you to your own room just yet.
I don't have, baby doesn't have to go to the corner yet.
Got a whole bunch of folks who are filling out the poll. I really appreciate it. It helps us really put together trainings that are geared towards your interests and your needs as we move forward with the CCGS program. All right, we're going to give everyone just one more minute to roll in this evening, and then we will jump in. All right, it is 6:10. We're going to get started. So first and foremost, I want to welcome all of our amazing participants for sticking it out through 4 whole days of SoilPalooza. This event that we've been hosting is brought to you by the California Alliance for Community Composting, and it's being funded by CalRecycle and the California Climate Investments Program. This evening, instead of Daniel, I am your host, Janelle, the tech wizard who has helped put this whole thing together. But Daniel is still here as a co-host to help out this evening, as is Courtney Brown. I'm going to give you a second for interpretation, Leticia.
What's the name of that other organization? California Investment?
Yeah, it's just what you're seeing on our shared screen. It's CalRecycle and California Climate Investments.
Climate Investments. Okay. Okay, I'm ready whenever you are for my Spanish.
Okay. So before we get... Go ahead.
Bienvenidos al día 4 del webinario SoilPalooza, presentado por California Alliance for Community Composting y está financiado por CalRecycle y California and, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that word, investments. Ahora, en vez de tener Daniel para facilitar nuestra junta, vamos a estar con nuestra experta, Janelle Luke, que también nos está asistiendo con método técnico. Ella y su compañera, Courtney Brown, asistiendo ahora con interpretación Leticia Garcia.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So before we get started, we're going to take a moment and Leticia will be moved to a separate audio channel. So folks needing translation can go in and get the interpretation of the speaking bits of our meeting. Leticia, I'm going to let you take it away and give folks instructions on how to access that.
Great. Para los que prefieren la presentación en español, favor de elegir el botón que dice español, que va a estar abajo de su pantalla. Si por casualidad no lo puede localizar, toque la opción que dice more o más, y allí lo encontrarán. Y después les voy a explicar cómo pueden preguntar una pregunta. Go
All
ahead.
right. Thank you so much. I am starting the Spanish audio channel now. Bye, Leticia.
Bye-bye. Talk to you later.
All right. So now that we've got everyone sorted out, hopefully in their preferred language, we're gonna just do a quick overview of how the flow of the evening is gonna go, which a lot of you already know this, but in case we have anyone new this evening, excuse me. So if you'd like to ask a question verbally, just use the raise hand function you should see on the little toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And that allows me to know that you want to ask a question and I can unmute you. We'll have a brief Q&A session at the end of each video, or sometimes at the end of one or two videos, depending on how long they are. And throughout the webinar, if you prefer, you can type your questions into the chat or into the Q&A at any time, and then we can read them out loud for you. All right. We're gonna attempt to answer as many questions as we possibly can, but obviously we have limited time in our webinars. So we're gonna try to collect any unanswered questions and find a way to pass that information along to folks after the webinar series. And I just want to let you know, because I've had this question asked several times now throughout the week, these webinars will be recorded and they will be posted to the California Alliance for Community Composting YouTube channel. We probably will get around to that next week once the webinar ends, and you are welcome to check in and access those later. So now, without further ado, I am going to take away our beautiful backdrop and I'm going to play our first video of the evening.
Hello everyone, this is Vera from Veriterra Lab, and this video is about compost maturation stage. For each style of composting, it is something different. I'm the most experienced in hot or thermophilic composting, specifically hot composting method taught by Elaine Ingham and the Soil Food Web School. I've done a few piles using this method, and this video will be based on my experience and also experience of other Soil Food Web students, graduates, compost producers operating in different climates, but mostly focused on California climate. So let's start with the definition. In thermophilic composting, the maturation phase is when a compost pile or windrow cooled down to ambient temperatures and you let it sit longer before using without mixing, turning or any other kind of disturbances. You can actually use it right away if you checked it and beneficial microbes are above minimum requirements. But if you let it mature, then the amount and diversity of microbes will increase. So according to the SoilPalooza School, the maximum diversity can be reached in 6-9 months. And in about 2 years, microbes will run out of available food and the numbers will decline. I saw pretty good increase in numbers and diversity in about 3-4 months. So if you need to use it earlier, it's totally fine. I also have leftovers of the pile that I made a year and a half ago, and it still has pretty good numbers of microbes. So now let's talk about how to take care of compost in maturation phase. In maturation phase, we want composting process to continue, and to do this job, microbes need water. Also, composting is aerobic process, so we want good levels of oxygen in our pile. We don't want to grow anaerobic microbes and create harmful material. Oxygen can't easily move through water, so it's kind of also related to moisture levels. And to make our job easier and protect compost from damaging environmental factors, the location is also important. So maintaining compost during its maturation basically comes down to choosing the right location and maintaining the right moisture and oxygen levels. And the moisture is probably the most important factor. Let's talk about location first. There are a few factors to consider: sun, wind, cold, things like rain and snow, and also animals, rodents, and other creatures. So ideally you want to keep your compost in shade to protect it from heating and sunlight. It's not always possible for large windrows in open spaces, but I know that you can order tarps that have light natural color that reflects light, unlike black tarps that accumulate heat. To protect the pile from wind from drying up, you can find a place next to the wall, fence or trees, or you can build a special structure for that. Tarps, covering with tarp also works, but not as effective as other methods. I was keeping my last piles in a windy location, and the side of the pile facing the wind was always drier. So if you are in the same situation, then you just need to do a better job on keeping the moisture. For cold, freezing winters, you may consider placing compost inside the building. You can also use some kind of insulation like blankets. And covering with tarp is necessary to protect from melting snow and from this cold freezing water getting into the pile. If compost froze, there is still a chance that microbes will revive back in spring. And in my limited experience, I find that freezing is less detrimental than drying. So that was more about climate and weather factors, but I also want to talk about animals that can become interested in your pile. It's not like we are trying to keep our pile in a sterile environment, because bugs and worms, they are helpful and they bring diversity, but sometimes it can be overwhelming. I put one of my piles in a location full of roly-poly bugs, and they literally infested my pile. I appreciate them crushing and helping decompose stubborn, waxy magnolia leaves, but I think they were eating fungi as well and affecting my numbers. And it was just too much of them, and it can be not good for plants as well. Another thing is rodents. For example, if you are composting in a location where rats are abundant, then you may consider keeping your maturing pile in hardware cloth, absolutely covered. Even though rodents are less interested in maturing piles than in actively cooking piles, they still can disturb it and they can start nesting there. Okay, so we already touched the topic of compost moisture. Now let's go into more detail. As I said, maintaining moisture is the most important part of maintaining maturing pile. It's not only necessary for keeping microbes alive and actively working on your pile, but is also specifically crucial for fungal growth. Fungi don't like stress. They don't like changing moisture levels, wet and dry periods. They need consistent moisture to grow. So based on my experience and experience of other soil food web composters, I came to conclusion that if compost is chunky, with all these air pockets between wood chips, then it's best to keep it at 50% free moisture level for maximizing the amounts of microbes. It's when you squeeze it and you can see 1 or 2 drops coming out of your fingers. And if compost has fine texture, then it's better to keep it about 40% free moisture level. It's when you can't squeeze any water out of it, but the material is sticky and holds together. I noticed that with fine compost at high moisture levels, it can get a little bit waterlogged, and I can see signs of low oxygen conditions like ciliates and more oomycetes. Also less fungi and beneficial protozoa go into dormancy. But the exception would be if you added worms into this kind of compost. To maintain moisture at these levels, check moisture preferably every day in different areas in the center and in the sides of the pile, and then mist with water until the moisture is right. It takes a lot of practice to define how much water you need every time. The frequency depends on the weather and the climate you are in. For example, in some arid locations, you might have to mist the pile twice a day. In some areas, it's only 2 or 3 times per week or less. In California, when I was watering my pile twice a week, the outside layer was always dry and it looked more like mulch. So if you don't want to lose the part of your pile, part, then check moisture more often and water accordingly. To keep moisture in your pile between waterings, you need to cover your compost with a tarp. You don't have to suffocate your pile and cover it all the way to the ground. Just keep a little bit of distance between the edge of the tarp and the ground level for airflow. If you keep your compost on a pallet, then you probably can cover it all the way to the pallet. Storing compost on pellets can help with drainage, but it's totally fine to keep it straight on the ground. And I also wanted to add about tarps. They are very helpful when it's raining because they protect compost from all this excessive moisture and prevent it from getting anaerobic. Another thing that can help keep precious moisture in your pile is worms. You can add composting worms straight into your pile, or you can add your pile into your worm composting system, like CFT. Worms can also naturally come from soil, and they are not only good for moisture levels, they also add diversity with microbes from their guts. They help prevent pathogens and they help decomposition. So that's all from me today. I hope this was helpful. Have a nice day and best luck on your composting journey.
Hello, everyone. We had Vera again coming in to share some more incredible information with us about compost maturation phase or aging or curing phase. So after we use one of those methods that we talked about yesterday to make your compost, there is going to be a period where the temperatures are starting to cool off and it really just needs to kind of sit and hang out. And that's when the fungi start to grow. They start to break down the woody materials a little bit better. And yeah, the pile cools off. And that can take a couple of months, depending on your materials and how your thermal phase went. But definitely a super important part of the process. And we always have to remember that our compost is alive. So we have to treat it with all the things that a living thing needs. Some moisture, some water. All right. So since we don't have a super crowded evening, would anyone like to ask any questions about maturing or curing your compost? All right. One second while I scroll to find you. All right, Karina, go ahead.
Hi there, everybody. I guess I had no idea that you needed to keep a maturing compost pile so moist. I live in inland California, where the summers are pretty much in the 90s every day and can go into the hundreds and sometimes even into 110 or more. So that's sounding like misting compost every single day, probably, correct?
It is definitely a possibility, and it might be good. And I know this isn't an option for all of us, but if it's possible, if you can find bulk materials like your browns that are a little bit finer, adding in stuff like some sawdust or straw can help make the pile a little bit denser and can help hold moisture in a little bit longer as well. I experience the same problem. I'm up in the foothills in Northern California, and it is very dry. And yeah, my piles require quite a bit of watering. It's another reason that ASP systems can also be really great, because a lot of them recommend that you cover your piles. So it's a closed system. You water it in the very beginning, and then you can put a cover over it that holds the moisture in while you push air through, and it helps keep them from drying out.
Okay, that's right. You're in Paradise. Is that true? Because I'm over in Sonora, so I think we have very, very similar climate.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And
Yep, you know.
when she says misting, is that like you're misting just the out, like pull back the tarp and just mist the outside, or are you trying to mix moisture actually into the pile?
If the pile has remained somewhat moist, if you mist it gently, it should be fairly easy to get water penetration just by misting the top of it. The water will travel down through. If it's been allowed to get very dry, it could become hydrophobic, and then you might need to open it up and mix it while you water it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Sorry,
Okay, good.
Yeah, I wanted to add to this question about misting. In these dry conditions that you are located, I think you need to, I mentioned it quickly in the video, that you need to check the moisture out in the outside layer and also in the center of the pile, because sometimes like in this maturation phase, the center is not getting hot anymore. So it's not, the pile is not drying from the inside out like in the hot phase, but like in higher humidity conditions, it can be enough to mist the outside layer and the center will be moist. But if you're in so dry conditions, I recommend checking, like pulling your hand right into the center, like in the middle of the pile, and checking the moisture there, because sometimes if you mist the outside, it may be not enough moisture to reach the center, and if it dried out. So I had this when I was composting in the summer, like in the beginning of the summer, and then I was maintaining the pile in the summer. So like eventually I had this some dry patches in the center of the pile because I wasn't checking it in the center. So yeah, it's really difficult. So maybe it makes sense not to keep, because it takes a lot of water to keep and maintain the pile. So if you have like, you may just keep it less longer, this maturation phase, if you're in sun dry conditions.
Yeah, and in my thank you so much. And in my condition, like we're not gonna try to sell the compost or anything. Like most of our point is to divert waste from the landfill or a school site. And so probably that helps the situation for me as far as like maturing less long. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. And as Janelle said, like the main goal, if you're not trying to reach super high diversity and numbers of microbes, so your minimum goal is to prevent the compost from getting like a hydrophobic, and so it will repel water and it will be very difficult to use it and bring the moisture back. So at least like you can keep it like 30-40% moisture, but not lower, so that it's not getting water repellent.
Okay, thank you so very much.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for the questions and for the answers as well. We have a couple questions in the chat, and then we will hop into our next video. So Raquel has asked, to what extent are rodents bad for your piles? I know we'll have some folks hopefully at our trainings that'll have a little bit more information about pests and compost for us. So in this particular scenario, I would say with the maturing compost, it'd be pretty much what Vera was mentioning. Not a lot of rodents are typically going to be attracted to the piles as much, but not for the food anyway, but they could definitely be attracted for housing, which ultimately typically is more unfortunate for the rodents than for us at that point, because having to disrupt families of rodents in your piles is not fun for anyone involved. And when it comes to your cooking piles, you know, I mean, the big concern with rodents is typically that they're going to poop in things. If they're pooping in your maturing compost, it's kind of a bummer because you don't have a chance to heat that pile back up on the chance that there's some kind of pathogens that could be a problem in their feces. So really, I'm gonna say it's just because they're vectors and people don't want them around in large numbers, defecating and coming into contact with things that people are going to use to grow food or put on their food. So yeah, probably not bad for the piles. It's more a human problem. And then there was a question that's, what moisture level did you say the worms prefer, Vera, in your video?
Worms, they prefer like 70-80% moisture level. So if you have worms in your pile, if you edit them, it's kind of helping you also like keep moisture, because they kind of keep the materials, they have moisture outside their bodies. So yeah, and they kind of prevent anaerobic conditions even in this high moisture environment. And they prevent pathogens from growing because they have some abilities for that.
So yeah, high moisture. So it will be, I have another video about compost quality testing, how to test moisture. So if you squeeze it, it's like more than like about 3-4 drops, maybe 5 drops coming out of your from your hand. So it's about 70-80% moisture levels.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. We are going to roll into our next video here before we get back to Vera again. And we're going to check out a video from Catalyst about compost sifting, something you're going to want to do after your compost has matured, potentially.
Hey everyone, Keisha here again. I have been asked to do a little video on good ideas for small-scale composters that want to sift their material. And I thought this is a perfect one for me because we actually, I'll get this out of the way right now, we don't sift our compost. And if there's been one critique that I've had to deal with over the past years, or one question that people have is just like, why don't you sift your compost? People are very, very used to going to the store and buying a bag of composted material. When you open it up, it's quite dry and fluffy and obviously sifted. There's no chunks in it to speak of. And you know, it's very easy to load that up into your seedling trays. It's an easy product to work with. Honestly, it's an easier product to bag. All of it is easier when the compost is sifted. But I believe, I know for a fact that the quality of the compost comes down as you sift the material. Now, understanding that sometimes we do have to sift just to use the machinery that is available to farmers today, I want to talk to you about some different ideas on how to do it and go over perhaps some ideas on how to store it longer and make the most out of the microbial life in your compost before you sift. So you can see in the photo right here, this is typically what our compost looks like. We leave chips in all the way up to 4 or 5 inches. And those big giant chips, we actually sift those out by hand, which might sound crazy, and it is crazy, honestly, but the compost that we produce, and if you produce a microbial focused compost, you'll see what I mean. It is very moist and very sticky. The glues that are produced by the bacteria and the fungi, they create a stickiness it's so dense that it's almost hard to wash off your hands. After you squeeze the product and you go into your bathroom to quickly rinse it off, it's not so quick to rinse off, and that stickiness kind of translates to everything we do and creates issues with sifting, bagging, and moving this product through machines all the time. So let's look at who we're trying not to damage, right? So what we found was, at first when we were building compost, and this photo isn't actually from compost, it's from an old growth forest, but I really wanted to show you these fungal webs, what they look like, when we look at them under a microscope with our eyes. And these communities of microorganisms, the fungi especially, it gets broken up when we sift it. So whether we're putting it over a mechanical sifter with a shaker, like a vibratory unit, or we're sifting with our hands, or even when we just pick it up with a tractor and move it, we're going to break up these communities. We're going to make them smaller, and they're going to have to start all over whenever they land wherever they're at. So what I want to point out is these chunks that we're taking out are actually woody materials. These are, wood chips, branches, bits of plant matter that are very durable. These are the food resources for our fungi. And, often when I leave a pile sitting, I look at it under a microscope, I'm going to see very visibly with my eyes, I'm going to see fungal hyphae growing off of these wood chips. Sometimes they become completely covered with them. So it's like a long-term food resource for our fungi. And it is also the structure holder in the pile. So when we build this pile and it has all these different sizes of wood chips, from 4 inches all the way down to a millimeter, and we have a lot of diversity. Not only is it diverse food resources, but it's creating a structure in that pile. So I know with our compost, even if it gets quite dry, it's the structure of it is held, and we're able to just pour water back on top of it, and it sucks it up like a sponge. And so during the period of time when our compost goes from hot to coming down to ambient temperature, getting ready to be sold, we make certain that we keep our wood chips in place. Now, if we want to sift the compost, we're definitely going to have to dry it down quite a bit. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of stickiness to deal with. And that stickiness, as soon as you try to sift it, you'll see what I'm talking about. It gums everything up and it begins to fill all the holes and cracks and crevices. And so sifting no longer happens. So honestly, to get it through a sifter, we're going to want to dry it down first. And so we don't want to do that very often. And so what I say is, try to either yourself, don't sift until you're going to use the compost. Don't sift unless you have a really good reason to. And help educate your clients as well that there's a very good reason that those sticks and chips are in place. Now, there is, when we're talking about very large scale, and often when we're dealing with food waste, there's a lot of plastic and trash that gets in the system. No matter what kind of composting you do, you're gonna see little bits of trash come through unless you handle every single portion of the material production on your own. It's always gonna be there. But in some instances, it's, there's a lot of plastic bags, gloves, spoons, plastic cups, things that have to be sifted out. And so in that case, I give that a pass. Got to get that stuff out of there. But it's still going to alter the structure of the pile. So what we like to do is just let people know, keep it with those wood chips in it as long as you possibly can. And then be creative in your sifting. At scale, there's many, many machines that you can use. These pictures I'm going to show you, these aren't my photos because like I already admitted, we don't sift our compost. We actually, as we're bagging it, we hand pick out anything that's over 3 inches, sometimes even 2 or 3 inches. It's laborious, but it makes sure that there's still enough wood chips in that bag to provide that structure, that when it's going through the mail and heading to our customers, it's not getting compressed and compacted and going anaerobic, effectively changing the community of organisms in the bag. So this picture here is a normal sifter that you could buy online. This photo is actually from Amazon. And I wanted to point out how tiny these little holes are. This is actually marketed as a compost sifter, and if your compost is quite dry, it could work. But I'm posting this just so you could get an idea. Any frame that you make out of wood or that you have of metal, you could pop those screens out and just put in something a little bit bigger. And so a lot of the folks I know that are screening their compost and still thinking about microorganisms, they're screening it down to a 1/2 inch, maybe even bigger. But it's going to depend on whether your compost is going to be going through a compost spreader, in which your client would know exactly how much space there is for that compost to go through for chunks, or if you're trying to use very small seed trays. So it is possible that you might need to sift down to 1/8 of an inch. I don't know. I've seen very, very small plugged seed trays, but this shaking method, and I hate to say get online and Google it, but there are just so many pages on how you can make your own DIY sifter. There's permaculture people out there, soil people everywhere sharing this information. I know in the past for ourselves, we've had a sifter that we put over it's got like handles on both sides. It looks just like this photo, only with much bigger with handles, and 2 people just back and forth sift over a wheelbarrow, and that's worked great for us in the past. Oftentimes I think it's best to just use what you have at home. I would say I really like this next design, and I have a friend that has made almost this exact tumbler. Excuse me. They used they use PVC just like this, and then they actually took a wider screen like I talked about, and they laid it on the inside. And they even use the buckets like this, which is just genius. And what I like about that is, with, like I said before, this compost is so sticky, it's going to fill up the holes quite easily. So when we're looking at a mesh that's this small, I think very quickly your compost is going to start building up on the edges, and you're going to have to clean the whole thing just to get started again. And so that's going to be where you have to play around a little bit with what type of compost you have, how dry is it, how does it go through this machine. And, you know, if you build the frame for this out of the PVC, the only thing that really needs to be switched if the holes are too tight is that mesh on the inside. And so, yeah, it's a nice way to get started, start playing with your compost, playing with your product, and seeing, you know, where are the design flaws and what can we do to actually make it work for a stickier, more moist compost. And these can be built too. You don't have to use the bucket. You could use any circle, or, you know, you could even use wire just to reinforce it. And, you know, this method could be, you know, 6 feet wide and 3 feet, or 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, you know, big enough to put in, you know, totes of compost. So you could really, and you could even add a motor onto it to make it easier. So, you know, I recommend really just checking out what other people are doing, talking to other small-time producers, and just seeing, you know, what method is providing them with a way to sift their compost quickly and easily. And then again, I would remind you to just try to keep those chunks in as long as you possibly can for our fungi friends. All right. Again, thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
All right, we are back. That was another awesome video by Catalyst Bioamendments, Keisha. I really love that she makes a point to say that you don't have to sift your compost. You don't have to sift your compost. I don't sift my compost either. I love all the different size particles that I see in it, and think about all the critters that are living in them. However, yes, sometimes some people feel a little off-put by it when they come to pick it up, and it requires some extra explaining. So, all right. Do we have any questions about sifting compost? I see there's a question here in the Q&A. Julie is asking, can you plant vegetables directly into unsifted compost? Well, in my experience, once your compost has gone through this maturation phase, depending on the vegetable, if they like fairly nutrient-rich material, then yes, you can plant vegetables directly into it. I think oftentimes people think that woody compost has more fungi, which could potentially mean that certain types of plants aren't as excited about it as others. But I have never had a problem planting things directly into my unsifted compost. Definitely make sure it's mature though. I think it's more an issue of making sure that it's matured, that it's good quality. There's some shifting of nitrogen forms that happens when it matures as well, into forms that plants prefer. All right, Karina. We have another question and a raised, oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, it was just left over. I do not have a
Oh. No problem at all. Yes, sifting is definitely can be a pain in the butt. I'm actually sometime here in the next couple of weeks going to build a trommel, which was that little roller that Keisha showed at the end of the video. They call that a trommel. and I've collected a bunch of bicycle parts to build a DIY trommel. Go ahead, Vera.
I just wanted to add about these things with planting vegetables in unsifted compost. So I think for seeds, like small seeds, like carrot seeds, what I did is just I applied my unsifted compost with all the wood chips to the soil, and then I had very mature compost in which I used low amount of wood chips, so it was kind of fine. And I just above all this applied unsifted compost, I added these strips of this fine compost, and I planted these carrot seeds into these strips. So you kind of can get creative. You can apply the most amount of compost and then fine tune your planting technique.
Absolutely. And I would say that certain types of sensitive plants you can use to actually test the safety of your compost. You can get little pots and try growing things in your compost and see what happens if there's a lot of yellowing or if there's any deformation of the leaves of the plants. You might be having a problem, and you might want to look into that and maybe go through your process and see where something's not right. Okay. So someone asked in the Q&A, how long is ideal for maturation, and is there a time frame that's too long? Vera, would you like to answer this question too?
Yes, I can. So I mentioned this in the video that like perfect timing is like 6 to 9 months, but it's not necessary. So you can start using it at 3-4 months, maybe even after 2 months. And too long, probably 2 years. I mean, I'm sure in 2 years there will be still microbes present. Maybe it's not, it will be less active and less rich in microbes. But yeah, I think above 2 years, it will be too long. And imagine that you will be keeping this pile moist for 2 years. It's a lot of labor.
Definitely. Yeah, your compost system, your piles can essentially be a somewhat closed system. So once all those microbes start running out of food in that pile, it's definitely possible they'll be going dormant, they'll be going to sleep, and they'll be less active. Okay. I think I got all of your questions. Yes, and there is talk of DIY plans for a bicycle rim trommel, so stay tuned. Okay, one more question, and then we're going to hop into another video. We had a question that is citrus fruit waste good for composting? So I know I've definitely do not avoid putting citrus in my compost piles. Worms do have an aversion to this, but citrus going through hot composting is a little bit different than putting citrus directly in a worm bin. Vera, would you like to weigh in on this too?
Yes, I just wanted to edit some detail that I remember Elaine Ingham recommending for hot compost that is done without worms. You can probably add up to 30% of your pile in citrus waste, but no more than that, and better less than that, because citrus, they have this antimicrobial, antifungal compounds in them, and it will affect the activity in your pile. 30% or less, probably the best.
Perfect. Yep, I get pretty frequent citrus certain times of year in my compost. Definitely never a full 30% of a pile, but definitely less than that has felt perfectly safe. All right, well, we're gonna jump into another video here and hear some more from Vera about compost quality testing. So let's continue this conversation in a video.
Hi everybody, this is Vera, the owner and lab tech at Veriterra Lab, a soil biology testing lab. And in this video, I'm going to talk about compost quality testing. So first of all, I want to say that composts are not created equal, and some products labeled as compost can be actually harmful instead of bringing benefits for plants, soil and climate. So compost quality testing is basically defining if compost is safe to use for plants, people, and also if it has biological potential for soil regeneration. So compost can be tested in many different ways. It can be tested for undesirable things like heavy metal concentrations, pathogens levels, excessive salts, persistent herbicides, or even physical contaminations like glass and plastics. Or it can be tested for desirable things like plant-friendly microbes. So as you can imagine, there are many tests that you can do, and some of them can be pretty expensive, but you don't have to do all of them because it really depends on what you are trying to achieve with your compost, and also it depends on where this compost comes from. For example, if you want to increase low pH in your soil, you probably need to check pH of your compost, because if it's low, you're not gonna get results that you want. And I said probably because if you created biologically focused compost, maintaining the right temperature, moisture and oxygen level, then in this case the pH will be most likely in the desirable range, and you can only use biological tests and skip this pH test altogether. Another example, if you want to use your compost as inoculum to add plant beneficial microbes to your soil, then you definitely need to send a sample for biological testing. And of course, if you want to make and sell your compost, you need to look into regulations, into regular pathogen testing. You can also consider organic certification or STA certification, or you can go alternative route and start making biologically focused compost and go into regular biological testing. So those were examples of how to choose the right test depending on your goals, but it also depends on where you source your compost. If you make your own compost and you don't use manure that can have heavy metals, or you're pretty sure that your starting materials don't have any herbicide residues or any toxins, then you probably can focus on doing visual assessment of your compost and regular biological tests, and do chemistry and pathogen testing from time to time, or maybe in the beginning, just to get a sense of what kind of product you are making. So let's talk about visual and biological assessments. Biological assessment is basically telling you how good your compost is for soil regeneration, plant productivity and health, for improving soil structure and water holding capacity. I'm explaining this more in depth in the video about compost application benefits. Visual assessment or physical quality can provide some insight about chemical and biological qualities. So let's talk about visual assessment: color, smell, moisture and texture. Smell is very indicative. Any bad unpleasant odor like ammonia, vinegar, something rotting, vomit smell, means that this material is full of anaerobic microbes that produce harmful for plants, strong organic acids and alcohol. We want a slight pleasant smell of forest floor. It can be like slight earthy, woody smell. It can be mushroom smell. And of course, if you see different mushrooms growing out of your pile, it's a very good sign. The next is color. Ideally, we want to see dark brown, 70% cacao chocolate color. This color indicates presence of beneficial organic compounds like humic acids and fulvic acids. You can also passively pass water through a compost and look at the color of the solution if it's dark brown. Dark brown color can also be an indicator of beneficial microbes, but it's not always the case. Black color of compost means that at some point of composting process, anaerobic decomposition occurred. From my experience, black compost are usually bacterial dominated and they lack other necessary microbes like fungi, protozoa and nematodes. Also, black compost often contain anaerobic bacteria and they tend to be more acidic. So compost can be a little bit dark, but we don't want it to be black like coal. The next important thing is moisture. To test moisture, you simply grab a handful of compost and squeeze it. Ideally, we want to see 1 or 2 drops coming out or 50% free moisture for regular compost, or it can be 3-4 drops of water or 70-80% moisture for vermicompost. It will be perfect moisture level for microbes to thrive. If it is more than 4 or 5 drops or steady stream of water, then it means that your compost is waterlogged, oxygen dropped, and anaerobic microbes started growing. There is a possibility that it contains plant and human pathogens now, and that it's more acidic. If there is no water coming out and the material falls apart and can be blown away, that means very low moisture, below 30-20%, and it's not suitable for microbes. Such materials tend to be very hydrophobic and it's very difficult to rehydrate them and use them. Another problem if they can be unfinished, and once you add water, they heat up and they can burn your plants. If the material is sticky and holds together, that means about 40-30% moisture, and beneficial microbes can live at these conditions. But some biocompost producers say that numbers drops compared to 50% moisture, and others say that they don't see any difference between 30% moisture microbial activity and 50% moisture. Now let's talk about texture and structure. It's a good sign if you can see aggregates and kind of crumbly texture. That means that fungi together with other microbes created those beautiful aggregates. And this compost will be very beneficial for improving soil structure and water holding capacity. But it also depends on moisture level. If moisture is about 70-80%, you won't be able to see aggregates because the texture will be smooth, but this compost can still contain very good amount of fungi. Another thing related to texture is presence of undecomposed materials. Compost definitely shouldn't contain any green plants or recognizable clumps of manure, but it can contain some undecomposed wood chips. In good compost, those wood chips will be also covered with beneficial microbes, and overall compost doesn't have to have a fine texture. It can be chunky. You can also always sift it if you need, or you can make extract from this material. So overall it is better to have chunky compost full of active living microbes than fine but dead material. So that's it about physical qualities. Observing them can give us clues about biology, but it's not straightforward and it can be tricky. For example, I had a vermicompost that I abandoned for months, and when I checked it, it had still really good moisture level and very beautiful brown color, but under the microscope it was almost empty. no microbes, and even bacteria wasn't very abundant. That's why we need a microscope assessment. So let's talk about it. So the biological test through direct microscopy can tell us how good the compost is for soil and plant health. To test your compost, you need to take a few samples from different areas of your pile or windrow, and then we will take 1 gram of this mix it with water, and then take a drop of this solution, spread it on the slide, and put it under the microscope. Here is the camera, and you can see on the screen what now is going on under the microscope. By scanning the slide in different ways, we can measure fungi, count beneficial protozoa, nematodes, and then we can dilute further and count bacteria. By this method, we can also measure levels of potentially detrimental organisms like oomycetes, disease-causing fungi, and root-feeding nematodes. Large amount of yeasts in compost can also be harmful for plants. By direct microscopy, we cannot distinguish Salmonella or E. coli from other harmless rod-shaped bacteria, but we can spot other organisms that indicate presence of pathogens or that are pathogens themselves, like Spirilla, Spirochete, or Vibrio. We can also spot anaerobic or low oxygen conditions in the compost. I usually look at more than 1 drop when I'm performing the assessment, and in addition to this method, I also use nematode extraction. It's a way to assess, to more accurately assess the numbers of nematodes per gram, and also to see the diversity, the different types of nematodes present. So after the actual assessment, we calculate the amounts of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and disease-causing microbes per gram of compost, and compare them with the minimum requirements for biocomplete compost defined by Elaine Ingham. She's been working with compost and regenerating soils for 40 plus years, and she found that compost should have at least these minimum numbers of microbes to produce an effect on plant yields and soil health, and eliminate the need for fertilizers and pesticides. So after you receive the results, you can decide how you can use this compost, or maybe you should improve your composting technique. So that was all that I wanted to share in this video. Have a good day and happy composting. Hi everybody,
All right. Thank you again, Vera. I'm sorry the video is a little quiet. I noticed a few people mentioned, but my volumes are all the way up. I'm doing the best I can. I think the recording was just a bit quiet. Awesome. So getting a little bit more in depth there about some types of testing you can do on your compost, both at home and things you might want to consider sending it away to a lab too. For anyone here who is in the CCGS program, everyone will have a chance to send in a sample of compost from their site once they get going. And I believe that group of testing information is the STA testing. So it's going to include information like carbon and nitrogen content, carbon to nitrogen ratios. It's going to talk about the different types of nitrogen in your compost. And actually, Courtney, does the testing that we're doing include a biological assessment as well?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it can, if sites would like that. We are also really interested in seeing just how alive the compost is that we create. So doing more biological analyses and these at-home bioassay testing you can even do on your own for compost maturity. It's really also an exciting opportunity for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And I know that down in Southern California, LA Compost, I think, has resources for some community soil testing. And at the end of CCGS 1, Paradise Community Compost, which is my home for half of the time I'm living up here, was also purchased some testing equipment to help folks in the CCGS2 cycle get some more information about their compost. So we're working on figuring out how best to share that with the community. And we will follow up with you once I have the bandwidth to think about another project. Great. And we also have a really wonderful document that will walk you through and explain some of your soil test results once that process happens. But we've got a little bit of time before we're gonna drag you into that. So, okay, we do have a question in the Q&A. Can coffee grounds be used in vermicomposting? Well, I've never gotten any feedback from my worms directly, but I definitely drink a lot of coffee, and I put my coffee grounds in my little home worm bin, and I put them in my compost as well, and it seems to work out pretty well for me.
Mhm. My running joke is always, would you ask yourself to work without coffee?
Definitely not. So I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. Absolutely, coffee grounds in with the worms. Okay. Anyone else have any questions about quality testing for your compost? We'll have lots more information for you moving forward in year 2 when you're actually going to be approaching this subject. We just wanted to kind of show you some ways that you can follow the quality and maturation of your compost on your own as well. Yeah, go ahead, Vera.
I just wanted to wrap up this topic that I see a lot of insights if I do biological test and chemistry tests that can be done is just in a regular local soil testing lab if they have this compost manure testing type of tests. And so you can kind of see the correlation between if you test different composts and see different biology, and then you see different chemical qualities. That's very interesting.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And there's so much to know about soil biology and what that really tells us beyond just the microbial diversity in your compost and in your soil. All right. Well, I have 2 more videos for you and a personal testimonial as well. Our next subject that we've got planned for you today is compost distribution. So once you've made the compost and once you've sifted it, if you so choose, and once you've checked the quality and you feel really good about it, well, what do you do with it then? So I've got a couple of videos. They're not necessarily wholly focused on distribution, but I thought they were cute videos and they suggest a few ideas on how 2 different organizations, one in Reno, Nevada, and one in New York City, use or distribute their finished compost. So I'm going to play these 2 videos and then we can have a chat.
down-to-earth composting. We're here to save the food scraps.
But we can't do this without your help. It's simple. Just separate your food waste from the rest of your trash. Put it in your down-to-earth bucket and set your bucket out once a week. Then, one of our compost collectors will show up and swap out that full bucket for a clean one. And then the magic happens.
Composting is very cool. You pile a bunch of food waste and other organic material together, you let it sit, and then it turns into good food for your plants. Twice a year, we thank you with black gold. This can be used to fertilize your trees, lawn, houseplants, or vegetable garden. So you can just sit back and watch the life of your food scraps come full circle. Waste less and contribute more with down-to-earth composting.
Composting. So enjoy.
Do you ever wonder what happens to your food scraps when you throw them into a trash can? Most likely, they will end up in a landfill where they decompose anaerobically or without oxygen and produce methane, a potent greenhouse gas. But if your scraps are composted, they decay aerobically in the presence of oxygen, which doesn't produce methane. For some, a backyard compost pile is a perfect solution, but for those who live in large cities, this option is less viable.
New York, America, where we're getting food from all over the world. And for the most part, throwing it into the landfill is kind of wasting a resource that we've used so many resources to bring into the country. For us to actually take those resources in the form of bananas, avocados, to take those resources and recycle them, keep that local, reduce the amount of trucks it takes to actually move this material around and create a resource such as compost, which is going to help us grow a more diverse variety of food in the city, and we can actually reduce the environmental toll of all of this food waste that we have. The difference between majority of compost sites in the city and this compost site is that we don't use any fossil fuels, and we're the largest in the United States that runs on renewable resources, which means no fossil fuels being burned on the site, machines actually turning windrows. It's just people getting together as a community and getting this work done in the most environmentally friendly way.
Woo! Woo! One day he was calling me fossil fuel.
I like the thought of taking care of everything in your community. I try to do my part whenever I can.
This mound was built about a week ago. It's probably 140, 150 degrees right now. And if we don't turn it, it'll just get hotter and hotter and it'll run out of oxygen. So this is still brand new. The reason why it's so much heat is because there's so much organic matter to break down. The things that have like a lot of cellulose, like corn, mango pits, eggshells, those things break down in the later stages of the compost. And if they don't break down, they just become part of the structure. So you want to just...
Yeah, I guess I should ask you about the technique first before I start messing.
Basically what you want to do, add it to this edge right here. So you want to aim for right here. All right. What we're trying to do is we're trying to extend that ridge. All right. Yeah, you do that for a couple years and you start to do things like this.
So how hot did you say this gets?
It gets all the way up to 160 degrees. Woo. In the wintertime, it's the steam that brings volunteers.
Yeah, I bet.
They're like, what are you doing? You know, if you kind of keep putting your food in a trash can and that trash can gets emptied every week, you really don't understand what's happening. You don't understand your waste. If you are composting it and you come to a compost site and you see like, wow, this really takes a lot of work to break down, it kind of changes people's idea of how they buy food. It changes their idea of how they throw food away. You come to a compost site where you're like sifting through compost and you see a bunch of fruit stickers, it kind of gives you an idea, hey, maybe I should tear off this fruit sticker before I put this in the compost. Maybe I should buy a little bit less lettuce if I'm not gonna use it all. Maybe I'm buying too many onions or buying too many potatoes.
So where do you send the finished compost off to?
So there's a bunch of sites around the city. Since we're funded by the city, we're able to give the compost away for free. And we give it to community gardens, edible schoolyards program where they're growing food in school gardens. We have a dozen urban farms in Brooklyn that we actually supply compost to.
That's gotta feel real good though, keeping it local from start to finish.
Woo. I don't know, Domingo, I think I'm out of shape. So this is our sealing method. Takes these more mature compost materials and we put it on top of the really raw stuff, and it seals it from the outside conditions, so the smell doesn't escape, the heat stays in, and all the pests stay out.
We haven't had a rat on site since 2011. It stops the animals from seeing fresh organic matter just sitting out here. Because this is like Thanksgiving times 10 for any kind of creature.
And that's a pretty big accomplishment, composting in Brooklyn, where we see rats on the street, but they're not in our sites.
We don't often consider food waste as a resource. By throwing food waste in the trash, we ignore a natural process that can recycle our waste into a usable resource. Our favorite thing about this compost operation is its ability to create a community by helping volunteers appreciate this natural cycle.
The reason why doing it by hand is more important is because you can actually get a better sense of what's happening. Machines can't pull out trash. Machines can't say, hey, this doesn't belong. Hey, this fruit needs a chop. The machine is just, you know, no feeling, no emotion, no detail that a human brings to any kind of work. A site like this is very educational, and there's sites all around the world that come to study this site to see what we're doing so they can bring it back to their systems. And that really just makes it worthwhile to know that we're creating a difference not only by diverting the food scraps that we divert and turn it into a resource, but by educating people so that they can do the same thing that we're doing on their own scale. It's hard work, but what makes it worth it is the people, actually seeing the interest in the people, seeing the community that's made. This guy's got new muscles, man. I'm noticing that chest right there. Oh, okay. Okay,
You guys out here for brunch? Is that what I hear?
Thank you, fellas.
Yeah.
We gotta do that. Next time. A little late.
And we're back. So I know those videos weren't necessarily focused entirely on distribution, but the first one definitely showed how a bicycle hauler brings back some compost to folks who participate in their program. And the second video, I just love a little background that space that they're in, Red Hook Community Garden, is actually completely developed on top of an old parking lot. They grow all of that food in a space that is a paved parking lot, which is pretty incredible, in my opinion. And they also touch a little bit on how, because they have these hot piles that they're turning and they're moving, they cap the piles off with some of their finished compost to keep the smell down, that they're even able to have a pest-free environment in New York City. So it is possible folks. And another thing to point out that's a common way to keep pests out is they had those big spaces that are clear of all materials and tools and debris in between their piles and their sheds and in between piles. Yeah, so speaking of distribution, I figured I might share my own personal experience. Paradise Community Compost, we are a 501c3. So oftentimes we receive grant funding to help pay folks to do the labor work at our sites. And we have volunteers as well, but we do end up with finished compost. And the current location of Paradise Community Compost, we do not have an affiliated community garden site. We are in an industrial location, so there aren't really any applications on site for our compost. So what we do is I have a big pallet bin that was constructed by some friends with some fun little painted signs that designate it finished compost. And whenever we go out into the community for talks or for educational purposes, we notify folks that they can come pick up finished compost. Some of the feedstocks that I collect include spent coffee grounds, and they come to me in these lovely cotton bags, and I give them a rinse once they're empty. And I also collect burlap sacks from coffee shops, and we have a big bin that is stuffed with these, and folks can collect those, scoop some compost into it, and take it home with them. We do ask for donations because it is hard work to make the compost, and we have a donation bin on site where folks can donate to our nonprofit and pick up finished compost for free. Go ahead, Courtney.
Janelle, I was wondering if you could answer, how do we measure how much compost we're creating or distributing to the community? Do you weigh it, or do you track it by volume? And where do we record that information?
Oh, finished compost, tracking finished compost. Well, we have a super nifty calculation that helps us determine, based on our composting process and throughput, how much finished compost we'll end up with. For us personally, having folks come and collect finished compost has been kind of a new activity. But actually, I'm going to come back to you, Courtney, and is this going to be part of the wonderful new app that is being deployed for us?
No, I'm actually just genuinely asking this of community composters, because when we finish it and we give it to our community, you can put it in a 5-gallon bucket and say that it has that volume, but that volume is obviously very connected with like how wet or how dry it is. And then if we take that 5-gallon bucket and then we say what a cubic yard would be, and track it in yards, to me that seems easier than taking the weight of it, which when it is really wet is obviously going to be much heavier. So I don't know if you would recommend doing measuring all of your finished compost in volumes over weight. I've seen it done.
I think that would probably make sense, because volumes definitely feels more relevant at the end of this process. You know, in the beginning, to get those ratios, you need to convert everything to some kind of common measurement, but at the end, it's just for tracking. At our previous location, we did have a tractor that had a 1-yard scoop bucket on it, so we did track that way. Sometimes at events, we will bring small buckets or bags, burlap sacks that have been filled with buckets, so we can track it that way. mostly it's just to get an estimated value of what that amount of compost would be worth, so we can put a suggested donation price to it. Lee is mentioned in the chat. Prima talking about the bulk density measurements. You could do that as well if you were interested. That'll give you pounds per cubic yard of compost if you wanted to take the weight of that, if you were doing a volume measurement and were curious how much weight of compost. You could use that as a conversion factor. But yeah, I guess
about Prima's video is that you can do that bulk density testing at the beginning too for the feedstocks going into compost production. So you can easily find the weight of all of your inputs. And then you could use that bulk density bucket test to find the weight of your outputs. So you could get it in both measurements. And I'm also just kind of wondering too, with methodology types that we discussed yesterday, so a 3-bin system versus aeration versus aerated static pile, or these hand-turned windrows, like, do you see a significant difference in the amount of compost that is produced in the length of time? So where we know that we're getting like much more volume off of, say, a hand-turned windrow than we are off of vermicomposting, for example. So how the reduction factor is what I'm getting at. So with the methodology, do we know how much the volume of this food waste that we're putting into it becomes in the end as final compost?
I don't know that I've personally seen a lot of difference in the reduction amount. It seems to me that it's been more related to the amount of time involved. Thermal composting, I've definitely noticed a reduction in size much more rapidly of materials. But then again, it also depends on what kinds of materials you're putting into your piles and if you're sifting it. I feel like when my compost is sifted, I feel like I end up with much less material in the end because I use wood chips. Wood chips do not break down rapidly. And so the bulk of my finished compost really is a lot of woody material. So if that's sifted out, then I feel like I end up with much less material. Whereas someone who's maybe using a finer material with more surface area, sawdust, straw, paper, shavings, things like that, might see a much more significant reduction in the size of their finished pile, but end up, assuming they're sifting out any unbroken down browns, with more overall material. My recipe is exclusively food waste and wood chips, so most of what ends up being the real humic rich materials is the food waste. But that's only one part of the equation. So yeah, I think that's been more my experience than anything else. And even those piles do break down, given some time for the fungi to come in and break down those materials a little bit more.
Thanks for your perspective. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So we do have another question in the Q&A, and I'm sorry, I think I missed this on the last round, but there's a question about whether there is a common NPK nutritional range in mixed compost. Personally, offhand, I'm not sure. I feel like a lot of these materials register quite low on that kind of a scale, as compared to things you might buy in the store that have that range listed on the front with quite high numbers, up to 10 or maybe even 20. And I think it goes back to what Vera has been talking about this whole time. One of the main goals of compost really is to get some biological activity going. Yeah, Vera, would you like to elaborate on this a little more?
So about NPK, so what I know is some composts that were made with a lot of manure that can be high in some salts. They're most of the time they're high in phosphorus, and so this may result in higher phosphorus levels in your soil as well. And about nitrogen, yeah, so mostly I see high phosphorus, which is not the best probably outcome. Yeah, nothing else I can say about NPK in compost.
Yeah, and when we do our compost testing going into next year, when folks have some finished compost that they'd like to get looked at, there will be a total nitrogen percentage included in that reading, and there will also be some information about your different kinds of nitrogen that are available. Nitrogen is present in multiple forms in compost, and what form is predominant can give you more information about the maturity of your compost, because nitrogen forms change based on biological activity. Yeah, and another note on the biology as well. So when you're adding this compost into your soil, it's not like applying a synthetic fertilizer. So you're not taking the compost and putting it out into your soil, hoping that it's going to fulfill all of the needs of your plants. It will provide some of them, and it will kind of help boost your plants along. But the big thing with compost is that you're putting that biology back into the soil. You're rebalancing the ecology, and that jumpstarts all of that nutrient cycling to happen in your soil on its own. So all those microbes are going to interact with your plants. They're going to break down organic matter that's in that soil. They're going to pull nutrients off of soil particles, and they're going to keep all of these actions going. And it's going to balance out to where the microbes can release enough nutrients to support the plants that they're partnered with. So it's all about biology. You will get some nutrients, of course. And I do believe, and Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong, but worm castings tend to be a little bit higher in those plant available nutrients. And compost really just has a lot of organic molecules where those nutrients might not be available right away. But what those molecules do is hold that in your soil for later consumption to support the cycling that needs to happen. Yes, Vera, take it away.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct myself. So as you said, most of nutrients are in organic form, and the test usually shows us, this NPK test, soluble nutrients or inorganic forms, and those high phosphorus that I meant exactly soluble nutrients, so that might be a problem with some composts. Yeah, but overall, microbes make nutrients available from organic forms as well.
Yes, Courtney.
I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit about, say, a pile stayed during the maturation pile process actually did dry out. You weren't able to bring back the beneficial microbial population with watering it, but it is still a lot of organic matter, like you two are going back and forth about right now, with a lot of nutrients still in it, even if there aren't alive bacteria. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit too about just simply adding organic matter to soil to help jumpstart that carbon sequestration process that starts with the carbon molecules being in the organic matter and then being added to soil.
Yeah, Yes, Vera, I'm going to let you field this one.
Yes, I hope I fully understood the question. So carbon sequestration for me is when plants suck in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then pump it into the soil to feed microbes, and then those microbes, they take this carbon and they process it further. They release some of it as energy into the air again, but part of it they process into more stable forms where it will be stable. And so this kind of carbon sequestration, when we add compost, we definitely add carbon that plants captured into their bodies, and we composted it. Also, some carbon dioxide was released during composting process. So it's inevitable. When we compost, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so we add, instead of adding it somewhere to the landfill where it will be rotting, we add it to the soil, back to the soil, this part of carbon. And we also add microbes because we multiplied microbes when we collected all together, mixed them, all the surfaces, gave microbes more surfaces, more moisture, and we multiplied microbes and we added those microbes, and they will be stimulating plants to pump more, to photosynthesize better, to pump more carbon into the soil, and they will be processing more carbon into stable form. So this is how I understand this carbon sequestration. And so this just with clarification that when we add compost, it's only part of the carbon sequestration, and the main part is going on when plants photosynthesize and interact with microbes.
Thank you so much for that thorough explanation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, is, adding that woody material back into the soil. It's still part of the carbon cycle. You're putting those dead plant materials that are super carbon rich back into the soil instead of burning them and releasing all of that carbon into the air. Maybe a little is released during composting, but the majority of that is going back into the soil, where it can kind of support all of these other cycles, soil ecology, and new plant growth. Well, it seems that we've had a bit of an early night tonight. Does anybody else have any more questions this evening? Anyone have any amazing compost distribution stories they'd like to share? Oh, we do have another question. So, Mari, master gardeners in Sacramento teach or have taught that they don't like wood chips in the rhizosphere, which is the root zone of plants, because they think they may lock up nitrogen during their breakdown. Is this still current thinking? They advise wood chips as a perennial mulch. So I've heard a lot of thoughts on this subject, particularly up where I live. Wood chips are in extreme abundance because of recent wildfires. And so wood chips are really high in carbon. And carbon is well known, especially when you get into like a charcoal type of field. Carbon is known for grabbing on to different types of materials that are in your soil. So wood chips alone, if they have not been composted, there is a potential that if you are pouring plant available type nutrients into your soil that they could kind of latch on to those wood chips. I have yet to see a setting where that is a huge problem. And what I would recommend if you're worried about this is, yeah, use your wood chips as mulch on top. If you're going to pour fertilizers onto your plants, if you need to do that, maybe just scooch the wood chips back a little bit. But that's one of the benefits of composting wood chips as well, is you're going to be coating them with all of these nutrients and all of these compounds and all of these microbes, and they're not going to be quite so much of a magnet anymore. Vera, would you like to build on this topic?
Yes, I agree with everything you said, and I want to add 3 points to that. So first, the reason why wood chips or high carbon materials can be think of like they're robbing your nitrogen is that when microbes like fungi, they start decomposing high carbon sources, they still need nitrogen for their activities, so they take it from soil nearby those wood chips. And I think if you composted them and edit it as compost containing wood chips, then this compost already has this nitrogen, and you're not affecting much soil nitrogen. You're just adding all this to your soil. And there was some study, like it's considered safe to add straight wood chips as mulch because they're not in straight contact, they're not mixed into the soil. But some say if you till in just wood chips, then you will have problem with soil nitrogen maybe. And I know that there was some study done with people who promote mulch, wood chip mulch, and they compared soil nitrogen with adding and not adding wood chips, and they didn't see much difference. And the last point that I want to add, that many farmers that add wood chips as mulch and then they see in their field or somehow, and then they see some kind of issues, they tend to blame wood chips, where the problem could be that their soil was compacted and they just suffocated it even more with just putting wood chips above. So it's when a farmer tells you that he or she had a problem with wood chips, so we always need to ask questions and clarify everything. Yeah, those were my 3 points.
Absolutely. I'm going to say overall, I think wood chips are good. All right. Do we have any more questions this evening? Anyone else have any thoughts or comments? All right. Well, I guess if nobody has any more questions, we might call it 10 minutes early tonight. Well, I'm going to bring Leticia back. Hello. Thank you so much for being our interpreter again tonight.
Thank you so much. Felt much more comfortable today with our topics. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I hope we weren't talking too fast.
No, you were fine.
Thank you again.
And I really
so much.
appreciate the videos that have the subtitles, so then I can just, you know, I do a little summary at the end and kind of explain when you guys are going back and forth with the questions, translate the questions and the answers.
Perfect. I'm glad that that's been helpful. Thank you again so much, Vera, for coming and hanging out with us tonight and sharing your infinite knowledge when it comes to composting and soil science.
Thank you all. I'm going to sign off. Good night. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Final day of SoilPalooza tomorrow night.
Woohoo! That's wonderful. You guys done an amazing job. Amazing. I'm impressed with all of the knowledge. I personally have learned a lot. So who total novice, I feel that I've walked away with a lot of information. So thank you for everyone being so clear and so precise in answering the questions. They were very patient. I feel a wonderful job. I feel you did a great job.
Thanks, Leticia.
Good night.
Good night.